At exactly 9:17 p.m., inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a crystal champagne glass slipped from Evelyn Sinclair's hand and shattered across the black marble floor so loudly that the orchestra stopped playing mid-note. For one strange second, nobody moved. Nearly 300 guests turned toward the staircase at the center of the ballroom, and the expression on Evelyn Sinclair's face changed so fast it frightened the people standing closest to her. Because the woman slowly descending those stairs was never supposed to become the center of attention. She was supposed to disappear into the background. Polite. Forgettable. Just the nanny Evelyn had spent the last 11 months quietly humiliating inside her own home. But the moment Claire Bennett stepped beneath the chandelier light, the silence inside that ballroom became impossible to ignore. Conversations died halfway through sentences. A senator lowered his wine glass without realizing it. Two photographers near the entrance suddenly turned their cameras away from celebrities and pointed them toward the staircase instead. And then someone whispered the question that changed everything. Who made that dress? Claire heard it. So did Evelyn. The gown was deep emerald silk, perfectly fitted, elegant in a way that didn't beg for attention, yet somehow demanded every eye in the room. The stitching was flawless. The structure looked custom-made. Even people who knew nothing about fashion could feel there was something different about it. But one man in particular recognized it instantly. Nathaniel Laurent, the 70-year-old founder of Laurent House, one of the most respected fashion brands in America, had spent 4 decades dressing first ladies, actresses, and royalty. And now he was staring at a nanny like he'd just seen something he thought no longer existed. Real talent. What nobody inside that ballroom knew was that Claire Bennett had spent the last 7 months designing that gown alone in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Queens, sewing after midnight, while the Sinclair family slept upstairs in their penthouse across the river. And what began as Evelyn Sinclair's private joke was about to become the worst mistake of her entire life. Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, the Whitmore Foundation Gala looked exactly the way Manhattan's elite preferred their nights to look. Crystal chandeliers hanging above imported marble. Billionaires shaking hands beside television cameras. Political donors trading quiet favors over $12,000 bottles of wine. Women wrapped in diamonds that had once belonged to old banking families. Men speaking in lowered voices about investments large enough to change cities. To anyone standing outside the ballroom, it looked perfect. But perfection has a way of hiding the people who no longer belong inside it. And that night, Evelyn Sinclair believed Claire Bennett was one of those people. For nearly a year, Claire had worked inside Evelyn's penthouse overlooking Central Park. She cared for Evelyn's 7-year-old son, prepared meals when the house staff left early, and quietly disappeared whenever guests arrived. Most people who entered the Sinclair home barely noticed her. That was exactly how Evelyn preferred it. Because Evelyn Sinclair loved control. Control of rooms. Control of conversations. Control of appearances. And according to several former employees who later spoke privately about the Sinclairs, Evelyn had a habit of testing people she believed were beneath her. Small humiliations. Casual remarks disguised as jokes. Invitations designed less as kindness and more as entertainment for the wealthy friends surrounding her. Which is why Claire's appearance at the gala confused almost everyone who knew the family. Especially because Evelyn herself had insisted she attend. Weeks earlier, while planning the event, Evelyn reportedly laughed with friends about the idea of bringing the nanny to a room filled with Manhattan's most powerful people. One guest would later describe it as watching someone invite a stranger onto a stage just to enjoy what happened next. But somewhere between that invitation and Claire Bennett walking down those stairs in emerald silk, something shifted. Because the gown Claire wore did not look borrowed. It did not look affordable. And it definitely did not look homemade. The construction was too precise. The silhouette too refined. The stitching too disciplined. Even under ballroom lighting, the fabric moved with the kind of balance fashion houses spend years trying to perfect. People who had attended Paris runway shows leaned closer to study it. Women who normally ignored staff members suddenly stopped speaking when Claire passed beside them. And while the room struggled to understand what they were looking at, Nathaniel Laurent never looked away. Because he had spent 40 years studying fabric, proportion, and design at the highest level imaginable. He had built an empire identifying talent before the rest of the world saw it. And the moment Claire stepped beneath the chandelier light, he noticed something almost nobody else did. The dress had no designer label, no signature branding, no visible fashion house markings, meaning whoever created it had done so without recognition, connections, or industry backing. Nathaniel Laurent understood immediately what that usually meant. Hidden talent. Real talent. And as Evelyn Sinclair smiled nervously at guests pretending everything was still under control, one question quietly spread across the ballroom faster than gossip. Who exactly was Claire Bennett? Because by midnight, the answer to that question would threaten far more than Evelyn Sinclair's reputation. And one man in that ballroom had already begun putting the pieces together. Claire Bennett was 34 years old the night she walked into the Whitmore Foundation Gala, though most people who met her assumed she was older. Not because of wrinkles or appearance, but because hardship has a way of changing the way someone carries themselves. Claire moved carefully, spoke carefully, observed everything. The kind of woman who listened longer than she talked, partly because life had taught her that people revealed more when they believed nobody important was paying attention. 7 years earlier, Claire had been living in Chicago on a partial scholarship at the Harrington Institute of Design, one of the few fashion schools in the country respected by both luxury brands and old European houses. Professors described her as unusually disciplined. While other students chased trends, Claire studied construction, balance, tailoring, and fabric movement with near-obsessive focus. One instructor later recalled that she treated fashion less like clothing and more like architecture people could wear. Then her father got sick. At first it was fatigue, then hospital visits, then months of treatments that drained every dollar the family had left. Claire left school quietly during her final year and never returned. By the time her father passed away 18 months later, the apartment was gone, the savings were gone, and the future she imagined for herself had disappeared with them. People often assume dreams collapse dramatically. Most of the time, they disappear slowly. One overdue bill at a time. One compromise at a time. One survival decision after another. By 30, Claire Bennett was working as a nanny in Manhattan for families wealthy enough to spend more on dinner parties than most Americans earned in a month. She moved between luxury apartments, private schools, and charity events where staff members learned quickly to stay invisible. And despite everything she had lost, Claire never completely abandoned fashion. She simply practiced it in secret. In a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Queens, she spent nights sketching designs inside old notebooks she kept hidden beneath her bed. She repaired secondhand garments to study stitching patterns. She watched runway collections on an outdated laptop with cracked speakers while eating takeout noodles at 2 in the morning after 12-hour shifts. Sometimes neighbors heard her sewing machine running long after midnight, steady and patient like someone refusing to let a part of themselves die. And somewhere during those quiet years, Claire became exceptionally good. Not trendy, not loud, good. The kind of skill built through repetition, discipline, and disappointment. Which is exactly why Evelyn Sinclair failed to recognize the dangers sitting inside her own home. Evelyn had spent most of her adult life mastering appearance. In the early 2000s, she became well known across New York social circles after winning a nationally televised beauty competition that eventually connected her to hedge fund investor Richard Sinclair. Their marriage turned Evelyn into a permanent fixture in Manhattan charity culture, where image mattered almost as much as money. To the public, Evelyn appeared polished, generous, perfectly controlled. But people who worked for her described something different. She rarely raised her voice, rarely insulted anyone directly. Her cruelty lived in smaller moments. The delayed introductions, the dismissive glances, the subtle corrections spoken just loudly enough for others to hear. She had a talent for making people feel insignificant without ever appearing impolite. And Claire Bennett became one of her favorite targets. Not openly, never enough to attract criticism, just enough to remind Claire where she stood. At parties, Evelyn introduced her as the help while forgetting her name. When guests complimented Claire's appearance, Evelyn laughed and explained how a good nanny should at least look presentable. Once, during a fitting for a custom gown, Evelyn asked Claire to hold pins in her mouth while designers discussed couture pieces as though she were furniture standing in the room. Claire rarely reacted, but she noticed everything, especially the clothes. She noticed when wealthy women pretended imported gowns were original despite copied European patterns. She noticed uneven hems hidden beneath luxury labels. She noticed poor tailoring disguised by expensive fabric. And more importantly, she noticed how often status mattered more than actual craftsmanship inside rooms filled with people claiming to understand elegance. That knowledge stayed quiet for months, until 3 weeks before the gala, when Evelyn Sinclair made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. 3 weeks before the Whitmore Foundation Gala, Evelyn Sinclair invited Claire Bennett into the sitting room overlooking Central Park and offered her something that, at first, sounded unusually generous. An invitation, not as staff, not as help, as a guest. According to one former employee familiar with the Sinclairs, Evelyn mentioned the idea while several friends were visiting for lunch. The women reportedly found the situation amusing almost immediately. One of them even joked that it would be funny watching a nanny survive around real Manhattan society for one night. Evelyn laughed. Claire did not, but she accepted the invitation anyway. And that decision quietly changed everything. Because while Evelyn Sinclair imagined embarrassment, Claire Bennett saw opportunity. Not social opportunity, not status, something much more personal than that. For the first time in nearly 7 years, Claire saw a room filled with the kind of people who actually understood fashion. Real fashion, not logos, not wealth, craftsmanship. And somewhere deep down, a part of her wanted to know whether her talent had truly disappeared or whether the world had simply stopped noticing it. So while Manhattan prepared for its biggest charity event of the season, Claire Bennett began working in secret. Every night after leaving the Sinclair penthouse, she returned to her apartment in Queens and sat beside a sewing machine older than she was. She sketched patterns until dawn, measured fabric by hand because she could not afford mistakes. Burn marks slowly appeared on her fingertips from pressing seams late into the night. Neighbors later recalled hearing the steady rhythm of sewing through the apartment walls at hours when most of the city had already gone quiet. Claire never rushed. That was the difference between talent and mastery. She understood structure, balance, movement. She knew a dress did not need to scream wealth to command attention. In fact, the most powerful designs rarely did. And over 7 exhausting weeks, piece by piece, she created something elegant enough to survive inside a room designed to destroy her confidence. Meanwhile, Evelyn Sinclair prepared for the gala with very different intentions. Friends close to Evelyn later admitted she had expected Claire to arrive overwhelmed by the environment. A cheap dress, nervous posture, awkward conversation. Evelyn believed the contrast between Manhattan's elite and the woman caring for her child would entertain people quietly, without anyone needing to say the cruel part out loud. Because humiliation inside wealthy circles rarely announces itself openly. It hides behind smiles, compliments, polite laughter. And Evelyn Sinclair had mastered that language years earlier. The night of the gala arrived cold and rainy. Black SUVs lined the entrance to the Whitmore Hotel, while photographers shouted celebrity names beneath flashes of white light. Politicians stepped onto red carpets beside fashion executives and tech investors. Inside the ballroom, a live orchestra played beneath 20-foot ceilings covered in gold detailing imported from Italy nearly a century earlier. At 9:17 p.m., the main ballroom doors opened again, and Claire Bennett finally arrived. At first, nobody recognized her. Not because the dress was loud, because it wasn't. There were no diamonds covering the fabric, no dramatic cutouts, no desperate attempt to look expensive. The gown was deep emerald silk with a silhouette inspired by old Hollywood tailoring, fitted perfectly through the waist before falling effortlessly to the floor. The stitching was nearly invisible unless someone looked closely. Every seam sat exactly where it should. Every movement of the fabric felt controlled, balanced, intentional. People stopped speaking because true elegance often creates silence before admiration. And then the whispers began. Several guests assumed the gown came from Paris. Others guessed a private couture collection unavailable to the public. One socialite reportedly approached another guest asking whether Claire was secretly connected to European royalty. Nobody could understand how a nanny from Queens had entered the ballroom, wearing something that looked more refined than half the gowns surrounding her. But while most guests focused on the beauty of the dress, Gabriel Laurent focused on the construction. And that changed everything. At 70 years old, Gabriel Laurent had spent most of his life building Laurent House into one of America's most respected fashion empires. Designers feared his criticism because it was usually correct. Buyers trusted his eye because he noticed flaws others missed. And as Claire Bennett crossed the ballroom beneath the chandelier light, Gabriel studied the gown the way a master architect studies blueprints. The stitching, the shoulder structure, the precision of the silhouette. This was not beginner work. This was someone who understood restraint, proportion, and discipline at the highest level. Gabriel Laurent slowly lowered his champagne glass and asked the question that silenced the people standing nearest to him. Who designed that dress? Several guests immediately answered for Claire. Valentino, maybe. No, probably custom Dior. Looks European. Claire stood quietly for a moment while dozens of eyes settled on her at once. Then she gave the only answer nobody expected. I did. The silence that followed felt heavier than the orchestra music that had filled the room moments earlier. And standing near the center of the ballroom, Evelyn Sinclair finally realized something had gone terribly wrong. Because the woman she invited to humiliate was no longer invisible. She was becoming the most important person in the room. And for the first time all night, Manhattan's elite had stopped looking at Evelyn Sinclair completely. The shift inside the ballroom happened almost instantly. 10 minutes earlier, Claire Bennett had entered the Whitmore Foundation Gala as an afterthought. By 9:30 p.m., people were pulling out phones beneath the dinner tables searching for her name. Guests who had ignored her while she worked inside the Sinclair penthouse were suddenly pretending they recognized her from somewhere important. Fashion bloggers attending the gala began posting blurry photographs of the emerald gown online with captions asking the same question over and over again. Who is she? Within minutes, images of Claire standing beneath the ballroom chandelier spread across social media accounts connected to fashion circles in New York, Chicago, and Paris. Some users compared the gown to classic Hollywood couture from the 1950s. Others became obsessed with the precision of the tailoring. One fashion editor wrote that the dress carried the kind of restraint modern luxury forgot how to value. And standing near the center of the ballroom, Evelyn Sinclair watched the attention move further away from her with every passing minute. At first, she tried smiling through it, then redirecting conversations, then quietly reminding guests that Claire worked for her family. But nothing changed the momentum once Gabriel Laurent began asking questions. Because when Gabriel Laurent took interest in someone, the fashion world noticed. He approached Claire slowly, speaking to her less like a socialite and more like a craftsman recognizing another craftsman. He asked about the fabric choice first, then the stitching technique, then the gown's internal structure. Claire answered carefully, almost cautiously, but each response seemed to deepen Gabriel's interest even more. Nearby guests listened in silence. And that was when Gabriel noticed something that unsettled him. The methods Claire described sounded familiar. Too familiar. Over the last 3 years, Evelyn Sinclair had built enormous public attention around the Sinclair Women's Fashion Initiative, a luxury charity program claiming to support overlooked female designers. The foundation hosted runway events, fundraising galas, and limited edition collections sold to wealthy donors for astonishing prices. Evelyn positioned herself as a patron of emerging fashion talent, and Manhattan society rewarded her generously for it. But according to several independent designers interviewed months later, rumors had quietly circulated around the organization for years. Design concepts disappearing, sketches reused, ideas appearing in Sinclair-backed collections after private submissions. Nothing provable, nothing public, until that night. Because while speaking with Claire Bennett, Gabriel Laurent recognized specific construction techniques almost identical to several signature pieces Evelyn Sinclair had publicly taken credit for during previous charity launches. The same sleeve balance, the same hidden seam structure, the same unusual hand-finished stitching style rarely taught outside elite design programs. Gabriel's expression changed immediately, and Claire noticed. At first, she said nothing. But as guests continued gathering around them, Gabriel asked whether she had ever submitted work through the Sinclair initiative before becoming a nanny. Claire hesitated for several seconds before quietly admitting that years earlier, shortly after moving to New York, she had mailed several original sketches to a Sinclair-sponsored emerging designer competition. She never received a response. But 6 months later, one of the designs appeared at a charity showcase hosted by Evelyn Sinclair herself. Claire explained it calmly, almost like someone who had spent years convincing herself it no longer mattered. She never accused Evelyn directly, never raised her voice, but the people listening nearby immediately understood the implication. And for the first time that evening, Evelyn Sinclair looked genuinely afraid. Because wealthy circles can survive cruelty. They can survive arrogance. But they rarely forgive fraud. The whispers spreading across the ballroom changed tone almost immediately. Guests who once admired Evelyn now glanced toward her with cautious distance. A fashion columnist quietly stepped away from Evelyn mid-conversation after overhearing part of Gabriel's discussion with Claire. Two investors connected to the Sinclair initiative reportedly left the ballroom early to make phone calls. Meanwhile, photographers kept surrounding Claire Bennett. Not because she demanded attention, because she no longer needed to. Confidence had begun replacing hesitation in the way she carried herself. Years of invisibility were slowly falling away in real time, and everyone inside that ballroom could feel it happening. Claire stood straighter now, spoke more clearly, and somewhere beneath the fear and disbelief, another emotion had started appearing. Relief. As though after years of silence, someone important had finally seen her exactly as she was. Gabriel Laurent continued studying the gown carefully before looking back at Claire with an expression several witnesses later described as deeply personal, almost emotional. Then he asked her one simple question, a question that instantly quieted the entire conversation surrounding them. Where did you learn to sew like this? For several seconds, Claire Bennett said nothing after Gabriel Laurent asked where she learned to sew like that. The ballroom around them remained loud, filled with glasses clinking and distant orchestra music, yet the small circle surrounding Claire had gone completely silent. Because by then, everyone close enough to hear understood that Gabriel Laurent was no longer being polite. He was investigating. Claire lowered her eyes briefly before answering in the calm, measured voice she had carried all night. I studied fashion design in Milan for a year, she said quietly. I was accepted into Bellesi Academy before I left. The reaction was immediate. Bellesi Academy was not an ordinary design school. It was one of Europe's most selective fashion institutions, known for producing designers who later worked for luxury houses in Paris and Milan. Several guests standing nearby recognized the name instantly. One woman reportedly laughed softly in disbelief, assuming Claire had to be exaggerating. But Gabriel Laurent didn't look surprised. He looked concerned. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The discipline, the restraint, the craftsmanship hidden inside the gown. Claire Bennett was not an amateur who accidentally created something beautiful. She was someone professionally trained at an elite level whose life had collapsed before the world noticed her talent. And as guests slowly gathered closer around them, Claire explained the rest. Her father became sick during her second year overseas. The medical bills back home grew faster than her family could manage. Claire returned to Chicago believing she would eventually go back to school after things stabilized, but they never did. Her father passed away 18 months later, and by then the debt had consumed nearly everything they owned. So she worked. First retail, then tailoring repairs, then childcare, eventually nannying for wealthy Manhattan families who never once imagined the woman helping their children sleep at night had once been preparing for European couture houses. Claire spoke without self-pity. That was what unsettled people most. There was no performance in her voice, no bitterness, just facts delivered by someone who had spent years quietly surviving disappointment. Gabriel Laurent stared at her for several long seconds before asking whether she still had any of her old work. Claire hesitated again, then nodded. Nearly 20 minutes later, inside a quieter private lounge away from the ballroom crowd, Claire returned carrying a worn leather sketchbook from her apartment. The edges were damaged from age. Several pages were stained from coffee and fabric chalk. It looked nothing like the polished portfolios Manhattan elites were used to seeing. But the moment Gabriel opened it, the room changed again. Page after page revealed designs so refined that several fashion executives standing nearby stopped speaking entirely. Evening gowns, structured coats, hand-drawn tailoring concepts, detailed stitching notes written in the margins. Some sketches dated back nearly a decade. Others looked startlingly similar to pieces Evelyn Sinclair's fashion initiative had publicly showcased over recent years. Gabriel turned pages slowly, carefully, like someone uncovering evidence. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody moved. Then finally, After several minutes of complete silence, Gabriel looked up at Claire Bennett with an expression witnesses later described as almost stunned. "These are extraordinary." That sentence spread across the ballroom faster than gossip. Within minutes, people who had ignored Claire earlier in the evening suddenly wanted introductions. Investors approached her cautiously. Fashion journalists asked permission to photograph the sketchbook. Women wearing designer gowns worth tens of thousands of dollars openly complimented the emerald dress Evelyn Sinclair once expected them to laugh at. And for the first time all evening, Evelyn completely lost control of the room. Witnesses later recalled seeing panic replace composure almost instantly. She interrupted conversations, forced nervous laughter, tried inserting herself back into discussions that no longer centered around her. Then finally, in front of several guests, Evelyn attempted one last move to regain authority. She accused Claire of copying the designs. The accusation landed badly, especially because Gabriel Laurent responded before Claire even had the chance to speak. He closed the sketchbook carefully, looked directly at Evelyn Sinclair, and delivered the sentence that would quietly destroy her reputation inside Manhattan fashion circles before the night was even over. "Talent like this cannot be imitated," he said, "only hidden." The moment Gabriel Laurent defended Claire Bennett publicly, the balance of power inside the ballroom shifted permanently. People who had spent years trying to impress Evelyn Sinclair were now watching her carefully, almost cautiously, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Conversations continued around the ballroom, but the energy had changed. Evelyn was no longer controlling the room. Claire was, and Evelyn knew it. Witnesses later recalled that she stopped smiling completely after Gabriel's statement. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, gripping a champagne glass so tightly that one guest reportedly worried it might crack in her hand. For years, Evelyn Sinclair had built influence through perception, through status, through carefully controlled appearances. But reputation inside elite circles is fragile, and once doubt enters the room, people begin distancing themselves quickly. Meanwhile, Gabriel Laurent kept turning pages inside Claire's sketchbook. Finally, he closed it gently and asked Claire a question nobody in that ballroom expected to hear. "Have you ever considered designing professionally again?" The room went quiet all over again. Claire looked genuinely caught off guard, almost uncomfortable, as though the possibility itself belonged to another lifetime she no longer allowed herself to imagine. For several seconds, she didn't answer at all. Then Gabriel stood. At 70 years old, Gabriel Laurent carried the kind of presence that made people stop speaking without being asked. Every executive, donor, and journalist in the ballroom knew exactly who he was. And when he stepped beside Claire Bennett beneath the chandelier lights, camera flashes immediately started firing across the room. Then he made the announcement that would dominate Manhattan society headlines for weeks afterward. "I would like to formally offer Claire Bennett a position at Laurent House," he said calmly. "Lead designer development. Full creative authority under our couture division. And if she accepts, her first collection will debut in Paris next spring." Several guests gasped audibly. One woman nearly dropped her phone. Because opportunities like that do not happen publicly, especially not inside rooms like this. Fashion careers usually move through connections, politics, and years of gatekeeping. But Gabriel Laurent had spent enough time around talent to recognize when he was standing in front of something rare, and he was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. Claire looked stunned, not dramatic, not emotional in the exaggerated way movies often portray moments like this, just overwhelmed, like someone who spent years teaching herself not to hope suddenly hearing the exact words she once dreamed about in silence. Around them, applause slowly began spreading across the ballroom, first from a few guests nearby, then more. Soon nearly the entire room was clapping while photographers pushed closer, trying to capture Claire's reaction beneath the chandelier lights. And standing only a few feet away, Evelyn Sinclair said absolutely nothing. Because there are moments when humiliation becomes impossible to hide behind social polish. This was one of them. The woman Evelyn invited to embarrass had become the most admired person in the room. The nanny she treated like background decoration was now being offered a Paris fashion debut by one of the most respected designers in America. And perhaps worst of all for Evelyn, the elite guests she once controlled were now ignoring her completely while surrounding Claire Bennett instead. For Claire, though, the moment was never really about revenge. That was the strange part. She never insulted Evelyn publicly, never exposed her angrily, never tried humiliating her in return. Claire simply stood there in the gown she created with her own hands while the truth revealed itself naturally. Talent, discipline, craftsmanship, the very things wealthy people often claim to value most, yet fail to recognize when it arrives without status attached to it. And maybe that was the real reason the story spread so quickly after the gala ended, because people recognized something painfully familiar inside it. For years, Manhattan's elite dismissed Claire Bennett because of the uniform she wore. They assumed the woman carrying groceries through service elevators could not possibly possess extraordinary talent. They confused financial struggle with lack of intelligence. They mistook silence for weakness. What they failed to understand was that brilliance does not disappear simply because the world stops paying attention to it. Sometimes talent survives quietly, working late into the night above laundromats, hidden behind jobs people overlook, waiting for the right room to finally notice. And on a cold Manhattan night inside the Whitmore Foundation Gala, that room finally did. So if you were Evelyn Sinclair, would you have recognized the talent standing inside your own home? Stories like Claire Bennett's spread online for a reason, not just because of the fashion, the money, or the humiliation inside that ballroom, but because almost everyone has witnessed some version of this happen in real life. Someone overlooked, someone underestimated, someone treated like they were invisible until the wrong person finally noticed what they were truly capable of. And maybe that's why the ending stayed with so many people long after the Whitmore Foundation Gala was over. Because Evelyn Sinclair spent years searching for status in rooms filled with powerful people, while Claire Bennett spent those same years quietly building actual skill when nobody was watching. So now we want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone underestimated like this in real life? Do you think Evelyn Sinclair deserved what happened that night? And honestly, would you have worn Claire Bennett's emerald gown to the gala knowing the entire room was waiting for you to fail? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because some of the best conversations always happen there. And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened when a hotel janitor recognized a billionaire's watch at a private auction and uncovered a secret that nearly destroyed one of the wealthiest families in Chicago. Subscribe now for more cinematic real-life drama stories every single week, because the next story might be even harder to believe than this one.